The letter lay there, folded once, damp around the edges, the ink slightly blurred. He almost stepped on it that morning. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling, slow, deliberate, as if each flake had its own memory to deliver. He hadn't seen handwriting in years, not like this. Careful, uncertain, as if written by someone remembering how to be gentle. The kettle clicked in the background. His daughter called softly from the next room. But he stood still, looking down at that envelope, his name written with a hesitation that felt familiar. He didn't know it yet, but the silence he once shared with a stranger was returning. In words she had never spoken before, the building breathed in small sounds, pipes clicking, a loose window shifting against the cold. Ethan stood by the counter, pouring water into the kettle, half awake. Mira's drawing paper was still spread across the table, a half-finished house surrounded by stars that didn't belong in daylight. He liked mornings before the city stirred, that hour when everything waited for permission to begin. The kettle hummed, steam curled upward, tracing brief ghosts against the kitchen window. He reached for the cup, and that's when he noticed it. The envelope. It had slipped under the door during the night. White, slightly bent, no stamp. No markings except his name, written in blue ink that wavered like breath held too long. He crouched, touched it lightly. The paper was cold, edges softened by damp air. He didn't open it immediately. He placed it beside the cup, as if waiting for it to explain itself. Outside, snow fell in fine lines. The world blurred behind the window, wrapped in its own hush. Mira padded in, hair tangled, dragging her blanket behind her. "Is it school today?" she asked, voice rough from sleep. He nodded. "Half day," she nodded back, satisfied with an answer that didn't require energy. While she searched for her socks, he found himself staring at the envelope again. There was something familiar about the handwriting. Not the style, but the rhythm of it. Letters pressed too hard, then soft again, like someone relearning control. He had seen that before, years ago. Rain pooling in the street. A girl sitting outside the cafe, trembling, drenched, refusing to speak. He'd only offered his jacket, and when she wouldn't look at him, he'd written a single note on a napkin. "You don't owe the world words. Just warmth." She had read it without expression, then written back one word, "Thanks." After that, she disappeared into the rain. He never saw her again. Until now, perhaps. The kettle clicked off. Steam drifted away. He slid the letter open carefully, the sound small and precise, like a secret unwrapping itself. The first line was simple. "I don't know if you remember me, but I remember the silence you shared." He exhaled slowly. "I was the girl you found that night. I didn't speak then. I can now. I'm writing because you once told me I didn't owe the world words. But I think I owe you this one." The page trembled slightly in his hands. He set it down, leaning on the counter, trying to absorb the presence of something that felt both far away and intimate. Mira's voice broke the moment. "Daddy, the heater's making that noise again." He blinked, folded the letter carefully, and nodded. "I'll fix it after breakfast. Routine as always." Stepped in to keep him from drifting too deep. But as he helped her with her shoes, his mind stayed elsewhere, between the lines of blue ink, between memory and now. Later that morning, he walked Mira to school. Their boots left small, even marks in the snow. She talked about a class project, her voice light against the cold air. He listened, nodding, the letter still in his pocket, folded like a pulse. At the school gate, she looked up. "You'll be here when it's over?" "Always," he said. He watched her join her friends, laughter rising, then fading as she disappeared through the door. He stayed a moment longer, looking at the empty space she'd left. The day moved quietly after that. At the repair shop, Ethan worked in steady rhythm. Wrench, cloth, turn, check. The radio murmured old songs he didn't quite hear. Each sound seemed to return him to that line in the letter. "You shared silence." He hadn't thought of it as sharing. He just wanted the rain to stop for her, but maybe that was enough. The simple decency of presence, not performance. At lunch, he took the letter out again. Under the harsh workshop light, the handwriting seemed even more fragile. The next paragraph read, "For a long time, I avoided sound. People mistook it for pride or fear, but it was neither. It was just rest. You were the only one who didn't ask me to explain." He paused. The wrench in his hand felt heavier than it should. In the hum of engines and metal, her words sounded louder than any noise. When evening came, snow had thickened. He picked up Mira from school, her small hand cold in his. They stopped for bread on the way home. In the shop window, soft yellow light reflected their shapes. His broad frame beside her bundled one, both slightly blurred by fogged glass. Back home, Mira drew again. This time 2 figures under a shared umbrella. He asked, "Who's that?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Just looks nice," he smiled faintly. The heater clicked on. The world settled back into its ordinary rhythm. But that night, after she slept, he unfolded the letter once more. The final lines read, "If silence was a language, you spoke it better than anyone I've known. I wanted you to know that I kept your note. It reminded me that being seen quietly is still being seen. Thank you. For that single night you probably forgot." Ethan sat there, the room dim except for the amber glow from the streetlight outside. He looked at his reflection in the window. A man holding something too delicate for words. He whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't forget." Then carefully, he slid the letter back into its envelope, placed it in the drawer beside a small paper napkin. The one that once said, "You don't owe the world words." The ink had faded, but the message remained. That night, sleep came late. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, silence. Not empty, but full. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something he couldn't quite name. Not closure, just the quiet recognition that kindness sometimes circles back. Written in trembling ink, found beneath a door. Morning arrived slow. Grey light, muffled wind, the faint ticking of a clock that ran a little fast. Ethan stood by the window, his hands around a chipped mug. The city below seemed caught between seasons. Snow melting into slush, the pavement holding its memory of cold. The letter still lay on the counter where he'd left it, half folded, half open. Its edges had curled slightly overnight, as if the paper itself was restless. He had reread it 3 times, not because he needed to, but because the words changed each time. Sometimes they sounded like gratitude, sometimes regret, and sometimes like a quiet request, one that hadn't yet found its voice. When Mira woke, she found him standing in the same place. "Are you thinking again?" she asked, yawning. He smiled faintly. "Maybe," she nodded, as if that explained everything. "Don't think too much," she added. "It makes your face look serious." He laughed, a sound more breath than voice. "I'll try." She climbed onto the counter, stealing a piece of toast. Behind her, the letter fluttered slightly in the draft from the window. "Who's that from?" she asked. He hesitated. "Someone I once helped. Are they okay now?" He looked at the letter again. "I think they're trying to be." When she left for school, he lingered in the doorway a little longer than usual. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and rain, the building's quiet signature. He noticed a small footprint near his door, lighter than his or Mira's. Someone had stood there, waiting. He traced it with his eyes. Then, almost without deciding, he slipped the letter into his coat pocket and locked the door behind him. At the shop, work came in waves. A neighbour's van with a cracked mirror, a student's bike chain jammed with rust. Hands moved, mind drifted. Between customers, he sat at the desk, the letter beside his tools. He read one line again. "I think I owe you this one." The phrasing stayed with him. This one. Not this letter, not this word. Something about it sounded incomplete, like the start of a promise. He wondered if there was another page, one never delivered. At noon, he walked to the cafe near the river, the same one from years ago. It hadn't changed much, the same corner table, the same old bell on the door that rang like a tired memory. He ordered coffee, sat by the window and watched the street. Outside, people moved in rehearsed patterns, hands in pockets, heads bent against the cold. He searched the faces without meaning to, half expecting someone familiar. But everyone looked like everyone else, carrying their own small silences. He unfolded the letter again, smoothing the creases. He turned it over, tracing the faint indentation where the pen had pressed too hard. On the back corner, something faint, almost invisible, a small pencil mark, an address, just a few letters, blurred by moisture. Building 6A, Riverview Homes. He read it twice, then set the cup down slowly. So it wasn't just a letter of memory, it was an opening. He left a few coins on the table and stepped outside. The air was thin, sharp with wind from the water. The river ran quietly beside the road, grey surface, carrying small fragments of ice. He found the building easily, a modest block of flats. The paint weathered. The railing rusted where hands once held on too long. Number 6A, he stood there uncertain. The idea of knocking felt intrusive. After all, what could he possibly say? He checked the letter again, searching for a name. There was none, just the voice in ink. He turned to leave, and then noticed something on the notice board by the entrance. A community poster, hand-drawn. Art therapy sessions, Saturdays, led by L. Harrow. The handwriting, unmistakable. The same uneven curves, the same hesitant grace. He didn't go in. He just stood there, looking at the poster until the paper blurred in his eyes. That evening, when he returned home, the hallway light flickered once, then steadied. He hung up his coat, the faint smell of cold air clinging to it. Mira was drawing again, this time hands instead of faces. 2 hands, one offering, one accepting. He asked, "Why hands?" She said, "They look honest." He paused, then nodded. "Yes, they do." Later that night, while Mira slept, he sat at the small table with a blank sheet of paper. The pen hovered above it for a long time. He wasn't sure what to write, or if writing was even the right thing to do. He tried once. "I read your letter. I remember the night." He stopped. The words felt too factual, too dry. He crossed them out, tried again. "You once said you owed me this one. Maybe I owed you silence." He paused. There was something about returning silence that felt right. The same kind of understanding that had started it all. He folded the page once, left it unsigned, and placed it under his own door, as if giving it to the same quiet that had delivered hers. The next morning, it was gone. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't felt the draft of movement, but it was gone. In its place, another envelope, thinner, lighter, on it, a single line written in that same tremulous blue ink. "Would you meet me, not to talk, just to listen? No name, no time, only a place. Riverside Bench, Friday, 4 p.m. The week passed in small distractions. Ethan went to work, made lunches, fixed the heater again. But the world seemed slightly tilted now. Sound carried differently. Light lingered longer in corners. By Friday, snow had melted into waterlogged soil. The sky was open, pale as unwashed linen. He left the shop early, walking slowly through the cold air. The bench by the river looked almost exactly as he remembered. Weathered wood, one side darker from rain. He sat down, hands folded, watching the river move. Minutes passed. Then, a quiet shift in the air. A figure approached from the far end of the path. A woman, early 20s maybe. Dark coat, scarf tucked too tightly. Posture that seemed both cautious and familiar. She didn't speak. She just stood a few steps away, eyes searching. Ethan nodded once. Not invitation, just recognition. She sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance. The river moved between them, slow, constant. For a long time neither spoke. And yet, something passed. Invisible, weightless, but real. The kind of understanding built not from shared words, but from shared weather. After a while, she reached into her bag and took out a folded napkin, old creased. On it, faint writing barely visible through the years. "You don't owe the world words." She placed it on the bench between them. Then, in a voice rough from disuse but steady, she said, "You were right." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The river kept its slow rhythm. Wind moved through the reeds. And for the second time in their lives, silence said everything that mattered. When she left, she didn't look back. He watched her figure blur into the distance, swallowed by pale air. The napkin remained, old ink beside new snow. He sat there a little longer until the streetlights began to hum. Then he picked it up gently, folded it again, and slipped it into his coat pocket, where her letter already rested. 2 pieces of paper, 2 moments of quiet care. No signatures, just proof that decency, once offered, finds its way home. The river thawed slowly that week. Ice broke into long, silver fragments that drifted downstream, clicking softly as they touched. Ethan stood there most evenings after work, hands deep in his coat pockets, as if waiting for something the water might return. The bench was empty again. Only the mark of 2 footprints lingered, hers and his, pressed faintly into the damp soil. The napkin now lived inside his wallet, folded next to her second letter. He hadn't reread it yet. Some things, he felt, were meant to rest between understanding and memory. Mira noticed the change first. "You go quiet when you think," she said one morning, buttering her toast with the concentration of a scientist. Do I? He asked. She nodded. It's like your face listens to something I can't hear. He almost told her about the river, the letter, the napkin, but he didn't. Not because it was a secret, but because it was still happening. Some stories, he believed, lose their meaning if spoken too soon. Days passed into an easy rhythm. Repair work, laughter from the neighbouring shop, Mira's crayons scattered like petals across the floor. Life resumed, but quietly changed, like a melody rewritten in a lower key. One evening after closing, he noticed something tucked into the workshop doorframe. A photograph, black and white, edges torn. It showed the riverside bench from years ago, rain pouring across the lens, a figure under an umbrella blurred almost to shadow. On the back, a short line in that same hand. You once sat through the rain. Maybe you'll do it again. Friday came heavy with weather. Clouds like wet wool pressed low against the rooftops. By afternoon, rain fell in deliberate, steady drops, turning streets into mirrors. He could have stayed home, but something about her handwriting, calm, patient, left no room for hesitation. He left the workshop early, locking up quietly. Mira was with a neighbour for the evening. He took the long way to the river, through back streets that smelled of wet concrete and pine soap. The bench was waiting. Same place, same silence. Rain ran along the wooden slats, gathering in small pools that reflected the faint orange glow of street lamps. She was already there. Same coat, same scarf, but this time her posture had softened, shoulders lower, hands resting open on her lap. Ethan approached without sound. She turned her head slightly, enough to show she'd noticed him, but not enough to break the quiet. He sat beside her. For a long while, the only sound was rain. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "You wrote back." He nodded once. "I didn't expect you to," she continued. "I only wanted you to know I remembered." He looked toward the water. Sometimes remembering is enough. A pause, gentle, not awkward. She drew her knees closer, gaze distant. "When I couldn't speak," she said, "everyone kept asking what was wrong. You didn't. I thought you just needed the noise to stop." Her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "Oh, I did. I still do sometimes." Rain gathered on her coat, darkening the fabric. She didn't brush it off. "Do you still write notes to strangers?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore. People don't read paper much these days." She looked down. "Maybe that's why I sent you one." He turned to her then, studying her face. Not to recognize it, but to remember how it had changed. Her features carried traces of silence, the kind that reshapes a person quietly, without leaving scars. A stray gust of wind lifted the edge of her scarf. She caught it absently, fingers trembling. He noticed her hands, faint ink stains along the side of her thumb. "You teach?" he asked. Her eyes flickered with surprise. "Art therapy, kids mostly, ones who don't talk much," he nodded. "Good work. They listen with their hands," she said softly. "Sometimes better than with ears," he smiled. "That sounds familiar." They sat like that, talking between pauses, letting silence finish sentences for them. When she finally rose to leave, she hesitated, glancing at him once. "You know," she said quietly, "that night wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was after, when people tried to turn kindness into a story." Ethan understood. Some things lose meaning when explained. She met his gaze. "Exactly." Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a small notebook, and tore a page carefully. She handed it to him. "Not another letter. Just something to keep the silence honest," she said. He unfolded it after she left. Inside, a simple sketch. A man and a child standing in light rain, sharing an umbrella. No faces, only the shape of care. When Ethan returned home, Mira was asleep on the couch, a book half fallen from her hand. He placed the drawing beside her crayons and stood there, watching her breathe. For some reason, the sound felt steadier that night. He sat down at the table, unfolded the sketch again, and beneath it, noticed faint writing in the corner. "You don't owe the world words, but maybe you owe it listening." He looked toward the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. Only the river light remained. Thin silver lines moving through the dark, like sentences written without ink. The following days brought warmth. Ice melted from the gutters. Children played in puddles that reflected the pale blue of early spring. Ethan found himself talking more. Not louder, just more often. To Mira about her drawings, to neighbours about the weather, even to customers, when words once felt unnecessary. But he noticed something else too. The silence between sentences had grown softer, not empty, restful. One afternoon, as he locked the shop, a familiar voice called from across the street. "Mr. Ethan?" he toned. The woman from the river stood there, holding a box of old paintbrushes. "We're clearing out the centre," she said. "Would your daughter like these?" He hesitated, not because of the offer, but because hearing her voice unbroken felt like seeing light through stained glass. He nodded. She'd love them. She crossed the road carefully, the box clutched against her chest. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. It was a brief contact, but something quiet passed. A shared understanding of what it meant to keep showing up, without demand or story. Mira painted that evening with a kind of joy Ethan hadn't seen in months. She mixed colours too fast, splattered the table, laughed when paint touched her nose. He didn't stop her. In the middle of her canvas, she drew the same two figures again. Under an umbrella, this time surrounded by small dots of yellow. "Fireflies," she said proudly, "because it's not raining anymore." He looked at the picture, then at her. "Keep that one," he said quietly. "It belongs here." Later that night, after she slept, Ethan walked back to the drawer. He took out the old napkin, the letters and the sketch. He placed them together, aligning the folds. They looked like fragments of the same sentence finally completed. Outside, the river light shimmered across the wall. Soft, wavering. He stood there a long while, hands in his pockets, feeling the small weight of unfinished gratitude. Not every story needed an ending. Some just needed a place to rest. And in that quiet moment, as night thickened around the apartment, Ethan realized something simple. Kindness, when given honestly, doesn't echo back in sound. It returns in presence. Spring came with the smell of metal and rain. At the shop, doors stayed open longer, letting in air that smelled faintly of soil. Children biked past in streaks of colour, shouting names that dissolved before they reached the end of the street. Ethan liked this season, when things fixed themselves quietly. Engines ran smoother, paint dried faster. Even silence seemed lighter, like it had room to breathe. On the counter sat a jar of wildflowers. Mira had picked them from the riverbank. Their stems leaned in different directions, untrained but alive. Beside them lay the old napkin, folded neatly under a piece of glass. Not as decoration, but as reminder. That evening, after closing, he found another small envelope in the letter slot. He didn't need to see the handwriting to know. Inside, a single photograph. Mira, painting by the river during one of her weekend classes. He hadn't noticed anyone taking it. The frame caught sunlight spilling across her shoulders, her face hidden by focus. On the back, one sentence. "She listens the same way you did." He sat down slowly, the room dim around him. For a long while, he only looked at the photo, tracing the outline of the girl's hand in air, brush suspended mid-stroke. 2 days later, he visited the art centre for the first time. The building smelled of chalk dust and rain-soaked coats. Walls were lined with children's drawings, bright colours bleeding into one another, as if joy refused to stay inside the lines. She was there, rearranging supplies, hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled. When she saw him, she didn't startle. She just wiped her hands on a cloth and nodded toward the open space. "I thought you might come," she said. "I saw the photo." "It wasn't meant to intrude," she said softly. "She paints like she's protecting something gentle." He smiled faintly. "She's teaching me how to do that." He watched as children moved around the room, dipping brushes, whispering, occasionally laughing. It wasn't loud laughter. It was contained, like music behind glass. She picked up a jar of water, replaced it without spilling. "She doesn't talk much during class," she said, meaning Mira. "But she hums when she paints, low, almost like breath." "That's her way of listening," he said. She nodded. "You said something once, that not speaking doesn't mean not being heard. I think I understand that now." They sat on the steps outside after class. Afternoon light shifted across the pavement, slow and uneven. He could smell turpentine and sugar from a nearby bakery. "I used to think silence was empty," she said quietly, "like a gap waiting to be filled, but now I think it's a kind of trust." He looked toward the river, visible through the trees. Trust in what? In being understood without asking. The words settled between them like dust catching sunlight, visible, but weightless. A breeze lifted, carrying loose paper from the tables inside. One sheet landed near Ethan's feet. He picked it up, a child's painting, clumsy but tender. Two hands reaching, not touching, a thin stream of colour between them. He held it for a moment before handing it to her. She studied it briefly. They all draw hands, she said. It's what they notice first. Maybe because hands speak the same language everywhere, he said. She glanced at him, that look people give when their thoughts align before they're spoken. As days turned longer, small gestures began to carry new weight. Sometimes she'd drop by the shop with coffee. Sometimes he'd walk past the centre just to leave paint jars on the windowsill. Nothing planned, nothing said, just the soft choreography of gratitude finding rhythm. Mira noticed, of course. "Is she your friend?" she asked one morning. "Yes," Ethan said. "She looks kind." "She is." Mira thought for a moment. "Does she listen like you?" He nodded slowly. "Maybe better." One afternoon, rain returned. Light, persistent, gentle. Ethan stood outside the shop watching puddles gather. She appeared across the street, holding 2 umbrellas. Without a word, she crossed, handed him one, and they walked toward the river. The bench was damp, but neither seemed to mind. Water rippled faintly, streetlight reflections breaking like breath. "She used to come here?" Ethan asked. "Your daughter?" "Yes," she said. "She paints water because she says it never stays the same." He nodded. "She gets that from you." "Maybe," she whispered. "Or maybe from you. The way you waited in the rain once." They sat quietly, the rain soft against their coats. Then she spoke again, slower this time. "I never told you why I stopped speaking back then." He didn't turn toward her. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "But silence loses meaning if it hides everything." She paused, fingers tracing the edge of the umbrella. "When I was younger, I used to think words caused harm. People spoke without care, promises, apologies, noise. After a while, quiet became safer. But then you wrote that note." Ethan listened. Rain tapping steady rhythms on the umbrella fabric. "You reminded me," she said. "That silence could also mean kindness. Not withdrawal, just stillness." He took a slow breath. "We both needed it then." "Yes," she said. "Maybe we still do." They didn't move for a long while. The city faded into the hush of weather. 2 figures under a small shelter, surrounded by rain that seemed reluctant to fall too loudly. When it finally stopped, she closed the umbrella and stood. He rose beside her. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Not as request, but as simple truth-seeking. She tilted her head, as if considering the shape of the question. "I think so," she said. "But if not, you'll know where to listen." Then she walked away, steps steady, unhurried. That night, Ethan placed the photograph beside the napkin and sketch. 4 objects, each carrying silence in a different form. He didn't arrange them neatly this time. He left them slightly misaligned. Imperfect, but real. Mira woke briefly, wandering into the kitchen. "Why are you awake?" she murmured. "Just thinking," he said. She looked at the table, at the scattered pieces of their quiet history. "Is that the lady from my class?" "Yes. She looks kind in drawings," Mira said. He nodded. "She is, even when she's quiet." Later, as Mira went back to sleep, Ethan stood by the window again. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement. Far off, the river caught a thin band of moonlight, not bright, but persistent. He thought of her words. Silence as trust. The idea felt truer now, that listening without demand was its own kind of care. He turned off the light. The room settled into shadow. And in that dark, filled with small, living sounds, ticking pipes, Mira's even breathing distant wind, Ethan finally understood. What we give quietly never disappears. It changes shape, returns softer, heavier, like rain made into memory. Autumn crept in quietly, with gold leaves clinging to the gutters outside Ethan's shop. Engines hummed slower. Morning started with fog instead of sun. Even the air had softened, as if the city itself was tired of speaking. It had been almost 3 months since the last note. No envelopes under the door, no folded napkins, no unannounced visits with coffee cups cooling between shared silences. At first, he thought it was distance, the kind that arrives gently, disguised as routine. But after a while, the absence began to sound like something else, something final. He waited another week before walking to the art centre. The windows were papered over, the signboard gone. Inside, faint outlines of where easels used to stand. The air still smelled faintly of paint and old rain, but the walls had been stripped bare. A caretaker sweeping near the entrance looked up when he stepped in. "Classes moved," she said before he could ask. "Different town. The teacher left a few weeks back." He nodded slowly. "Did she leave anything behind?" The woman thought for a moment, then pointed to a small box on the counter. "Couple of unclaimed things. Maybe yours." He opened the box right there. Inside, a small stack of letters, bound with red string, a dried flower, wild violet, and a folded piece of brown paper faintly water-stained. The top letter had his name. Only that. He took the box home, set it on the kitchen table. For a long time, he didn't touch it again. That night, the house felt heavier. The kind of quiet that used to comfort him now felt crowded, as if holding something unsaid. When Mira asked, "Are you okay?" he smiled and said, "Just thinking." But the truth was simpler. He wasn't ready to read words that might end something that had never quite begun. It was nearly midnight when he finally untied the string. The first letter was dated 2 months ago. "Ethan, sometimes silence begins as healing and ends as hiding. I didn't notice the shift until the day I stopped writing you back in my head. I think it's time to move before I mistake stillness for safety again. I wanted to thank you, not for saving me, but for showing me that listening could be an act of courage. You taught me how to stay, even when leaving is easier. Please keep fixing things. The world needs more people who repair quietly." He read it twice, then folded it neatly back. The next few letters were sketches more than words, half-finished sentences, brushstrokes pressed into paper. In one, a line read, "If one day you stop hearing from me, don't think of it as goodbye. Think of it as the sound of trust, still echoing." And in another, "I met someone who reminds me of you, not in how he speaks, but how he pauses." Ethan smiled faintly at that. He didn't feel loss in those words. Just distance, warm and honest. The last letter was different, short, written in ink that had bled slightly at the edges, as if caught in rain. "For the napkin. For the note. For every time you didn't ask me to explain, you were right. We are still heard, even in silence. Keep that truth safe for both of us. No signature. Just a small pressed petal at the bottom. Violet. The same as the one in the box." He sat for a long time. The letters spread before him like a map of quiet goodbyes. No bitterness, no brokenness, only gratitude that felt too large for words. He gathered them carefully and placed them in a drawer. Not hidden, just resting. When he closed it, something inside him felt lighter, as if silence had returned to its rightful shape. The following weekend, Mira found the box on the table. "Are these from her?" she asked softly. "Yes," Ethan said. "Did she go far away?" "Not too far," he replied. "Just where she needs to be." Mira nodded, thoughtful. "Will she write again?" He smiled. "I think she already did. We just haven't learned how to read it yet." She tilted her head. "Like listening without sound?" "Exactly." That evening, Ethan took Mira to the river. The air was cool, the sky brushed with copper light. He carried a sketchbook she'd left him once. Empty pages except for one corner marked, "For what's next." They sat where the rain had once fallen, where umbrellas had touched like uncertain bridges. Mira began to draw. Not carefully but freely, lines overlapping, colour bleeding. He watched her, the way her face tightened in focus, the way she hummed softly, almost without realising. When she looked up, she asked, "Can I draw her too?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, draw her how you remember her." Mira thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then I'll draw her listening." As the last light faded, Ethan glanced toward the water. A reflection shimmered there. 2 figures, still and small against the world. And for a fleeting second, in the pattern of ripples, he almost saw her. The quiet woman with paint-stained hands, smiling without sound. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just listened. To the wind, to the memory, to the living silence between them all. When they walked home, the streets were lined with fallen leaves. Each one made a soft, distinct sound underfoot, like the gentle echo of a life still being heard. That night, Ethan placed the last letter beside the others. He didn't seal them away this time. He left them open, part of the house, part of the quiet. Before turning off the light, he whispered, "Not to the air, not to the past. but to the kind of silence that listens back. Thank you. And somewhere beyond the city, maybe she heard. Or maybe she didn't need to, because sometimes the truest endings aren't heard at all. They're simply understood. Winter returned with the same quiet patience it always carried. The streets glistened under soft light. Shop signs blinked in slow rhythm. And in the apartment above the repair shop, Ethan's mornings began the same. Kettle, hum, breath, pause. Only now, something in the quiet had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was presence, softer, shared, like an echo that had learned to rest. Mira was older now. She had learned to fold notes the way the woman once had, creasing them neatly, placing them on her father's workbench with words like, "Don't forget lunch," or "Your hands smell like engines again." Sometimes she added small sketches. A cup, a hand, a single flower. Ethan kept every one of them in a tin box, just beneath the drawer where the letters rested. It wasn't a shrine. It was a continuation. On the first snow of the season, a delivery arrived. No return name again, only an address smudged at the corner. Inside, wrapped in parchment and cloth, was a framed painting. He unwrapped it slowly, fingers grazing the edges of the canvas. The image showed two figures on a bridge under rain, one holding an umbrella, the other standing bareheaded, face tilted toward the sky. Beneath it, a small inscription, "To the man who listened when I couldn't speak." He didn't hang it right away. Instead, he placed it near the window where the light would change across it throughout the day. Morning gold, afternoon silver, evening dim. Sometimes, when the world outside grew still, he'd catch a reflection in the glass. His daughter moving behind him, laughing at something unseen, and it felt, quietly, like all the threads had met again in that room. One evening, as they prepared dinner, Mira asked, "Did you ever tell her thank you?" Ethan paused, not with words. Then how? He looked at the painting, the faint rain caught forever in motion. "By living the way she once needed me to." Mira nodded, not as a child might, but as someone beginning to understand what people leave behind when they go. Later that night, after she had fallen asleep, Ethan stepped out onto the small balcony. The city breathed below him. Distant engines, wind between buildings, someone laughing 2 streets away. He thought of the woman, of her silence, her letters, her leaving, and he realized he had stopped wondering where she was. Because maybe she was in the sound of pages turning in Mira's sketchbook, maybe in the echo of footsteps crossing the shop floor, maybe in the stillness that filled the room each time he set another cup of tea beside an empty chair. That was enough. He leaned on the railing, watching flakes drift through the glow of a street lamp, and as he did, a memory surfaced. The first night he found her crying in the rain years ago. The way she'd written on that napkin with a trembling hand, "Thank you for hearing me." He had kept that napkin in his wallet all these years. He took it out now, worn, folded, faint, and for the first time, he placed it on the windowsill beside the painting. Not as a reminder, as a promise kept. The wind moved through the open window, lifting the corner of the napkin just slightly, enough to make it seem alive, and in that small motion, Ethan smiled, the kind of smile born not from happiness, but from understanding. Some connections don't fade, they just change shape, from presence to memory, to quiet proof that decency leaves a trace. At dawn, Mira found him still sitting by the window. She curled beside him, her head resting on his arm. Outside, the light spread slow and patient, turning frost to shimmer. "Is it okay if I paint this?" she whispered. He looked at her, then at the napkin, the painting, the morning. "Yes," he said. "But don't paint us," she frowned gently. "Then what?" He paused, the words arriving like breath. "Paint the silence between us," she nodded, and as she began sketching, the pencil moved softly, tracing not people, but the space that held them, the hush before words, the warmth between gestures, the small, fragile truth that even silence can be kind. By evening, the painting was done. Ethan looked at it. No faces, no names, just light and distance, and a quiet stillness that felt complete. He placed it beside the one sent to him. 2 paintings, one of rain, one of stillness. Together, they looked like a conversation continuing across time. Before bed, he wrote one line on a scrap of paper and slid it under the frame. we are still heard. In a world built on noise, their silence endured, not as absence, but as grace. What began as a note beneath a door became a life shaped by listening, and in the quiet that followed, they remained connected, not by words, but by the steady truth that kindness, once given, never really leaves.